The hearing room was packed that Tuesday morning, press gallery full, C-SPAN cameras locked in position. Mike Johnson entered exactly 7 minutes late, which was unusual for a man who prided himself on punctuality. He walked to the podium with the easy confidence of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this, who knew how these things worked, who understood that the outcome was already decided before the first question was ever asked. His staff had briefed him on the lineup. Nothing concerning. A few freshman representatives asking predictable questions about budget allocations, standard oversight hearing on federal contract spending. He would be home by lunch. Jasmine Crockett sat 3 chairs down from the center microphone. She wore a navy suit with a crisp white collar, her hair pulled back in a manner that suggested she had not come to perform, but to work. On the table in front of her sat 4 banker boxes. Not folders, not binders, banker boxes. The kind lawyers bring to depositions when they expect the defendant to lie. Each box was labeled with a year, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. The labels faced the podium. Johnson glanced at them as he settled into his seat, and something flickered across his face, brief as a pilot light failing, before his practiced smile returned. The chairman gavelled the session open with the usual formalities. Johnson delivered his opening statement from memory, which was impressive if you had never seen him do it before. He spoke about fiscal responsibility, about the sacred duty of stewardship over taxpayer dollars, about transparency and accountability as bedrock American principles. His voice carried the warm authority of a man accustomed to Sunday school lecterns and cable news green rooms. He made direct eye contact with individual committee members as he spoke, a technique that read as genuine to people who had never studied it professionally. When he finished, there was polite applause from the Republican side of the room. Johnson nodded his thanks, took a sip of water, and prepared for what he assumed would be a series of softballs lobbed by friendly colleagues, followed by a few hostile but manageable questions from the minority members, none of whom had the evidence or the stamina to do any real damage. The first 3 questioners asked exactly what his staff had predicted: budget projections for the next fiscal year, timeline questions about appropriations committee schedules, procedural clarifications on continuing resolutions. Johnson answered each with the smooth efficiency of a man who could recite parliamentary procedure in his sleep. The hearing was proceeding exactly as designed. Then Jasmine Crockett's turn arrived. She did not begin with a question. She began by opening the first banker box with the kind of deliberate care a jeweler might use when handling a particularly expensive stone. The cardboard made a crisp sound in the microphone. She removed a single manila folder, placed it on the table in front of her, and looked up at Johnson for the first time since the hearing began. Her voice when she spoke was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was the voice of a person who had stayed up very late for a very long time and had no interest in wasting a single second. She said she wanted to start with something simple, a matter of public record that should be easy to confirm. She asked if it was accurate that Johnson had, during his time as Speaker, publicly stated on no fewer than 17 separate occasions that government officials should never profit personally from their public service. She specified the number, 17. Not several, not many times, 17. Johnson's smile did not quite reach his eyes as he confirmed that yes, he believed deeply in that principle. It was foundational to everything he stood for. Crockett thanked him for his clarity. She said she appreciated men who took clear positions because it made accountability so much cleaner. Then she opened the folder in front of her and asked if Johnson was familiar with a limited liability corporation registered in Louisiana in April of 2021 under the name Pelican Strategic Consulting LLC. The room temperature did not change, but something in Johnson's posture did. His smile remained in place, but the muscles around it tightened in a way that cameras would later isolate and loop. He said he would have to check with his legal team about the specifics of any business entities his family might have established for estate planning purposes, but he could assure the committee that everything had been properly disclosed and was entirely standard practice. Crockett said she was certain it had been disclosed. She was holding the disclosure form right now. Public record. Filed with the House Ethics Committee in May of 2021, exactly as required. She had no questions about whether it was disclosed. Her question was narrower. She asked if Johnson was aware that Pelican Strategic Consulting had received its first contract payment 1 week after that disclosure was filed. The amount was $87,000. The client was a defense subcontractor called Meridian Systems Group, which had, at that exact moment, 3 separate bids pending before committees on which Johnson either sat or had significant influence. Johnson's answer came faster this time. He said he had no operational role in his wife's business affairs. She ran that company independently. He had no input into its client list, its contracts, or its day-to-day decisions. It was a clear firewall, established on the advice of Ethics Counsel and entirely appropriate under House rules. Crockett nodded slowly as if considering this explanation with genuine care. She said that was helpful context. She appreciated him clarifying that he had no operational role. She reached into the same folder and removed a second document, which she held up briefly to the camera before placing it flat on the table. She said this was an email dated April 19, 2021, sent from Johnson's personal Gmail account to the CEO of Meridian Systems Group. The subject line read, "Kelly can help with your DC strategy needs." Kelly was Mrs. Johnson's first name. The email went on to describe in 2 short paragraphs how Kelly Johnson's firm specialized in helping defense contractors navigate the federal procurement process, and how her unique understanding of congressional priorities made her particularly valuable to companies seeking to align their proposals with current legislative focus areas. The email concluded by suggesting a call the following week to discuss Meridian's upcoming contract portfolio. Crockett looked up from the document and asked if this refreshed Johnson's recollection about his involvement in his wife's client acquisition process. The silence that followed was not long by normal conversation standards. 5 seconds. Maybe 6. But in a congressional hearing room with cameras running and reporters typing, 6 seconds is a geological age. Johnson's face cycled through 3 distinct expressions in that time. First, confusion, as if he were trying to remember whether he had actually sent that email. Then recognition, the moment he realized he had. Then calculation, the rapid mental sorting of which defense would work best. He said the email was taken out of context. He had simply been making a social introduction between 2 professionals. His wife ran a legitimate consulting business. Companies hired her for her expertise, not for access to him. The suggestion that there was anything improper was frankly offensive and exactly the kind of partisan attack he had come to expect from members who could not win on policy. Crockett let him finish. She did not interrupt. She did not raise her voice. She waited until he had fully committed to that answer, until it was entered into the record with the same legal weight as sworn testimony. Then she opened the second banker box. This box contained not folders but a single 3-ring binder, thick enough that it made a sound when she placed it on the table. She said she wanted to test Johnson's theory about his wife's expertise being the reason companies hired her. She said that was a testable hypothesis. If companies hired Kelly Johnson for her expertise, there should be evidence of that expertise being delivered. Contracts should have deliverables. Consulting engagements should produce work product. She said she had submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to 7 federal agencies that had awarded contracts to companies that subsequently hired Pelican Strategic Consulting. She had requested all work product, all reports, all strategic assessments, all documented communications related to the services Pelican Strategic had been paid to provide. She opened the binder to a tabbed section marked Meridian Systems Group and read aloud from the FOIA response. 0 documents responsive to request, no work product on file, contract payments totaling $240,000 across 18 months, no reports delivered, no assessments filed, no strategic plans documented. She turned to the next tab. Northbridge Defense Solutions, same result. $312,000 in consulting fees, 0 documents, no work product. She continued through 5 more tabs, each one the same. Payment records clear and documented, work product non-existent. She looked up from the binder and asked Johnson a simple question. If his wife was being hired for her expertise and not for access to him, could he explain what expertise she was delivering that left no paper trail, no reports, no documents, no evidence of any kind that any work had ever been performed? Johnson said this was absurd. Consulting work was not always documented in the way a formal contract might be. Strategic advice was often delivered verbally, phone calls, meetings, guidance that helped companies position themselves more effectively. Just because there were no formal reports did not mean no value had been provided. This was a fishing expedition designed to smear his family, and he would not dignify it further. Crockett said she understood his frustration. She said she had also wondered whether the work might have been verbal rather than documented. That was a fair point. So she had done something else. She had requested phone records, not the content of calls, which would require a warrant she did not have, just the metadata. Call logs, durations, timestamps. She had requested Kelly Johnson's business phone records for the 18-month period during which Pelican Strategic had been paid over $900,000 by these 7 companies. She turned to a new section in the binder and read the summary. Total documented business calls between Kelly Johnson and representatives of the 7 client companies during the contract period, 11. Total duration of those 11 calls, 43 minutes. That worked out to approximately $21,000 per minute of phone conversation, which Crockett said would make Mrs. Johnson the highest-paid consultant in American history if her expertise was genuinely that valuable. The silence that followed was longer than the first one. 10 seconds, 12, 15. Somewhere in the press gallery, someone coughed and the sound carried in the dead air like a gunshot. Johnson's hands, which had been resting flat on the table in front of him, curled slowly into fists. His jaw worked as if he were chewing on a response that refused to take shape. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its warm, Sunday school quality. He said Crockett was deliberately misrepresenting how consulting relationships worked. She was cherry-picking data. She was ignoring in-person meetings, email correspondence, and collaborative work that would not show up in a phone log. Crockett asked if he would like to provide evidence of those meetings, that correspondence, that collaborative work. She said she would be happy to enter it into the record right now. She waited. Johnson said he did not have that information with him. His wife's business records were not something he carried to hearings. This was an ambush, and it was beneath the dignity of this committee. Crockett said she understood he did not have the information with him. She said that was understandable. It had been only 6 months since she had requested these same documents from Mrs. Johnson's business attorney in a formal letter, a copy of which she now held up for the cameras. The letter had requested all contracts, all deliverables, all correspondence, and all meeting records related to the 7 client companies. She had received a response, which she also held up. The response, signed by Mrs. Johnson's attorney, stated that Pelican Strategic Consulting maintained strict client confidentiality and could not release proprietary strategic work product without client permission. Crockett said she had found that interesting because she had then contacted each of the 7 client companies directly and asked if they would authorize release of the work product they had paid Pelican Strategic to produce. She had received written responses from all 7 companies. 6 of them said they had no objection to releasing the work product. One company said they were unsure what work product she was referring to because they did not recall receiving any. She asked Johnson if he could explain why his wife's attorney was citing client confidentiality to block release of documents that the clients themselves had no objection to releasing and in some cases claimed did not exist. Johnson stood up. Not dramatically, not like a man storming out, but he stood, and in a hearing room where witnesses are expected to remain seated unless excused, the physical movement registered like a lightning strike. He said this hearing had become a partisan circus designed to harass his family. He said he had answered the committee's questions in good faith, but he would not sit here and watch his wife's private business dealings be distorted by someone with a political axe to grind. He said he was happy to return when the committee was prepared to conduct itself with the professionalism the American people deserved. Crockett did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She said she had one more question before he left, if he would indulge her for 30 seconds. Just one question? Very simple. Johnson hesitated. His staff was already moving toward him, one aide holding his briefcase, another reaching for the microphone at his seat to disconnect it. But Crockett's tone had been so completely calm, so utterly without aggression, that refusing a single final question would look like cowardice. He sat back down. Crockett thanked him. She opened the 3rd banker box and removed a single sheet of paper. She said she wanted to ask about one specific contract because it had stayed with her since she first read about it. It was a contract awarded by the Department of Veterans Affairs in August of 2022 for construction of a new outpatient facility in Shreveport, Louisiana, which happened to be in Johnson's district. The contract was awarded to a company called Covenant Construction Partners. The contract value was $42 million. Covenant Construction Partners hired Pelican Strategic Consulting 1 month before the contract was awarded. Pelican Strategic was paid $95,000. She said the contract ran into problems almost immediately. Work stopped after 6 months. Subcontractors filed liens claiming they had not been paid. Veterans who had been promised the facility held a protest outside the construction site. Local news covered it extensively. Eventually, the VA terminated the contract for cause, which almost never happened. Covenant Construction Partners filed for bankruptcy 3 months later. The Shreveport facility was never completed. Veterans in that region still traveled over an hour to receive care they had been promised would be available in their own community. Crockett looked directly at Johnson and asked a question with no possible good answer. She asked if the $95,000 his wife had been paid by Covenant Construction Partners had been returned after the company failed to deliver the facility it had been hired to build. She asked if any of that money had gone toward the veterans who still had no clinic. She asked if he thought it was good business that his wife had been paid for connecting a company to a contract that the company then failed to complete, leaving veterans without the care they had been promised, while Pelican Strategic Consulting faced no consequences and returned none of the fees. The silence that followed was total. 20 seconds. 23. Someone in the gallery later said they had counted to 30, but the official record would show 23 seconds of absolutely nothing. No sound, no movement. Johnson's face went through a color change that would later be analyzed by dermatologists on Twitter as likely indicating a blood pressure spike of clinical significance. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. It opened again. Still nothing. Finally, he managed a sentence. He said consulting fees were not contingent on contract outcomes. That was not how professional services worked. His wife had provided the services she had been hired to provide. She was not responsible for the client company's subsequent performance. Crockett asked what services those had been. Specifically, what had Mrs. Johnson done in exchange for $95,000 that had helped Covenant Construction Partners secure a contract they were apparently not qualified to complete? Johnson said he did not have visibility into the specific deliverables of every one of his wife's client engagements. He said this line of questioning was harassment. He said he was finished with this circus. He stood again, and this time he did not sit back down. He ripped the small microphone from his lapel with enough force that the wire pulled taut before disconnecting. His face was the color of something overcooked. His staff surrounded him immediately, forming a protective barrier as they moved toward the side exit. The cameras followed them all the way to the door. Crockett remained seated. She watched him leave with the expression of someone who had known exactly how this would end from the moment she had opened the first box. When the door closed behind him, she looked down at the fourth banker box, still unopened on the table in front of her. She did not touch it. She simply looked at it and then at the camera and let that image sit. The chairman, visibly flustered, attempted to restore order. He suggested a brief recess. Crockett said that would not be necessary on her account. She said she had no further questions for Speaker Johnson, though she noted for the record that he had left without answering whether his wife had returned any fees from the failed Shreveport contract. She said that answer would likely have been no, because if the answer had been yes, he would have said so immediately. People rarely fled questions when the answers made them look good. She said she wanted to read something into the record before the committee moved on. She said it was a letter she had received last week from a veteran named Michael Posey. Mr. Posey was 64 years old. He lived in Bossier City, just outside Shreveport. He was a Marine Corps veteran who had served 2 tours in Vietnam. He had been waiting 4 years for the outpatient facility that had been promised to his community. The facility that had been defunded after Covenant Construction Partners failed to complete the work. Mr. Posey drove 73 miles each way to receive treatment for service-connected disabilities at the nearest VA facility. He made that drive twice a month. He had written to Crockett because he had seen news coverage about the failed contract and wanted someone in Congress to know that real people were still affected by it. Crockett read 2 paragraphs from his letter. He wrote that he did not understand how a company could be paid millions of dollars to build something, fail to build it, and face no consequences while the people who needed that building just kept waiting. He wrote that he had voted for representatives who promised to take care of veterans, and he could not figure out why that kept turning out to be a lie. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. She said she did not have a good answer for Mr. Posey about why this kept happening, but she said she could tell him that it was not because no one knew. The information was all public. The contracts were documented. The payments were recorded. The failures were evident. The problem was not information. The problem was accountability. She said Speaker Johnson had opened this hearing by talking about fiscal responsibility and transparency and the sacred duty of stewardship. She said those were beautiful words. They tested well in focus groups. They sounded serious and principled. But when asked to explain why his family had collected nearly $1 million from companies that seemed to deliver no documented work, and in at least one case had failed catastrophically to deliver the project they had been hired to complete, Speaker Johnson had not provided transparency. He had provided outrage. He had not demonstrated stewardship. He had demonstrated flight. She said there was a reason powerful men reacted that way when presented with evidence. It was because evidence removed all the exits. You could not call documented payments partisan. You could not call FOIA responses a political attack. You could not dismiss phone records as fake news. When someone showed up with receipts, with call logs, with contracts, with letters from veterans still waiting for care, the only options left were to answer the questions or leave the room. Speaker Johnson had chosen to leave the room. Crockett said she wanted to be clear about something because she knew this would be framed as a personal attack. She said this was not about Mike Johnson as an individual. It was about a system that allowed public officials to profit from their positions through family members while maintaining technical compliance with ethics rules that had been deliberately written to permit exactly that kind of arrangement. It was about contracts awarded to unqualified companies that paid consulting fees to well-connected families and then failed to deliver on promises made to veterans, to communities, to taxpayers. It was about the gap between the rhetoric of service and the reality of self-dealing. She said Speaker Johnson had every right to be offended by her questions, but she was offended too. She was offended that a veteran in Louisiana was driving 73 miles for medical care because a company that paid the Speaker's wife $95,000 had failed to build the clinic he had been promised. She was offended that there was no work product, no documented value, no evidence of any kind that the nearly $1 million in consulting fees had produced anything except access to the Speaker's influence. She was offended that when asked to explain this, the Speaker had called it harassment and left. She said at the beginning of this hearing, Speaker Johnson had confirmed that he believed government officials should never profit from their public service. She had asked him to confirm that principle because she wanted it on the record, not because she thought he would uphold it, but because she wanted everyone watching to remember that he had said it, right before he was confronted with evidence of how thoroughly he had violated it. She said she had brought 4 banker boxes to this hearing. She had opened 3 of them. The 4th box contained contracts, payment records, and correspondence related to 8 additional companies that had hired Pelican Strategic Consulting during Johnson's time in leadership. She had planned to go through each one, but Speaker Johnson's departure had made that unnecessary. The evidence in the first 3 boxes had been sufficient to prove the pattern. The 4th box was simply confirmation that this was not an exception. It was a system. She said she would be filing a formal ethics complaint with the Office of Congressional Ethics within 24 hours. She would be requesting a full investigation into whether Speaker Johnson had used his official position to financially benefit his family members through a consulting arrangement that appeared to deliver no legitimate services. She would be requesting that the investigation examine not just the disclosed payments, but the connection between those payments and legislative outcomes, committee assignments, and contract awards that had benefited the companies making the payments. She said she expected that investigation would take months and would likely result in nothing more than a strongly worded letter about technical compliance with rules that were never designed to prevent this kind of corruption in the first place. But she said she would file it anyway because silence in the face of documented wrongdoing was complicity, and she had not come to Congress to be complicit. The chairman gavelled the hearing to a close. Crockett gathered her folders with the same methodical care she had used to open them, placed them back in the banker boxes, and stacked the boxes neatly at the edge of the table. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She looked tired, which she was. She had been working on this case for 7 months. She had filed the FOIA requests herself. She had made the phone calls to the 7 companies. She had read every contract, every payment record, every email her office had been able to obtain. As she left the hearing room, a reporter asked if she was satisfied with the outcome. Crockett stopped and considered the question seriously. She said satisfaction was not the right word. Speaker Johnson had fled the hearing, which meant he would face no further questions today. He would likely hold a press conference within the hour where he would claim persecution and partisan warfare. His base would believe him because they had been conditioned to distrust evidence that contradicted their chosen narratives. The ethics investigation she was filing would probably go nowhere because the system was designed to protect its own. But she said 30 million people would watch the clip of him ripping off his microphone and leaving rather than answering whether his wife had returned the fees from the failed veterans clinic. 30 million people would see 23 seconds of silence when asked what services his wife had actually provided. 30 million people would hear about the Marine Corps veteran driving 73 miles for care because a company connected to the Speaker's family had failed to build what they had been paid to build. She said you could not force accountability on people who had spent their entire careers avoiding it. But you could make the evidence so clear, so documented, so irrefutable that their refusal to be accountable became its own kind of answer. You could make them choose between telling the truth and fleeing the room, and when they chose to flee, you could make sure everyone saw them leave. She said at the start of this hearing, Speaker Johnson had dismissed her with a glance at those banker boxes and a practiced smile that said he had been in rooms like this 1,000 times before and knew exactly how they ended. He had thought she was inexperienced. He had thought she was unprepared. He had thought she was someone he could outlast with authority and procedure and the institutional weight of his position. He had been wrong about all three. She said that was not partisan politics, that was just math. Numbers in contracts, dates on calendars, dollars in accounts, calls that were not made, work that was not done, questions that were not answered. You could call math a lot of things, but you could not call it fake. And when a man fled a room rather than explain the math, that told you everything you needed to know about whether the math was in his favor. Michael Posey was still driving 73 miles to the VA. That was math too, and it was the only number in this entire case that actually mattered. Word count, $3,800.